Okay, so tomorrow is the planning meeting, just an update. And I have been too busy to make a more organized way to do this, but for the time being, I created this HackMD for people to leave updates regarding interesting things, like projects they've been working on. So if you're shepherding any projects, please take a look. I will maybe send out some pings. If I don't want to make any promises. Okay, action item review. Josh, did you do this? Summary of REPRC, MSVC. Josh? Okay, I don't know where Josh is, but as far as this goes, Ryan is going to, Ryan, Scott, and I have a meeting later to go over some of that stuff, so I guess we'll do that then. All right, let's move on. DRAF patterns. FCP is pending. I don't really think there's much of, I wrote action item here because I was going to write that I was going to open a Zulip stream or something, but I guess I'll wait till the FCP is over.
Am I audible now?
You are audible now.
Excellent. Wrong microphone, sorry. Yes, I did post to that one immediately after last week's meeting to provide the summary from our discussion in the meeting. So that has been updated, but then there have been a few discussions since then trying to sort out exactly what change should be made and how that could be done without breaking existing code.
Okay, we'll come to that later.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, nothing to do here but wait. But maybe, Mark, you can note down this action item for me to remember.
Yep.
Constu BRFC. So there's a pending FCP. Taylor, you registered a concern. Was it a serious concern? What was your concern?
Oh, Ralph actually already responded. My concern was basically, why are we doing this? And in the sense that it's not clear to me what the value add of offering these as guarantees rather than as sort of nice to have, like we detected that you have a bug behaviors is. And I left a comment sort of spelling that out and talking about how I think it might limit our abilities to optimize in the future, and also for alternative Rust compilers to offer a sort of, you know, no checks, maximally fast CTFE. Ralph responded, it sounds like the primary motivation is that like C++ does this. So if Rust is providing fewer guaranteed safety checks than C++, that's sort of unfortunate. I'm not totally sure I'm convinced by that, but.
I feel like I don't find either thing very convincing. Like, we could say that you're required to do it, and then people can offer flags that disable it for performance reasons. And yeah, they're not conforming with our spec or whatever if we ever have another implementation, but like, so what?
You mean like fast math?
Yeah, probably. I'm not sure what that is, but.
Oh, it's a somewhat famous GCC flag that does a bunch of not correct optimizations to make math really fast.
I see. Hopefully not quite like that. But like if you're saying CTFE compilation time performance is a critical concern, it seems like it could be addressed other ways. But
yeah, I think I could be convinced by that. I do think though that it's not clear to me that there's a ton of value in saying that, you know, we promise to provide errors on these certain pieces of undefined behavior in CTFE, which sort of turns those pieces of undefined behavior into effectively defined behavior. Ralph is making a distinction in the RFC and in their comment too between things that users of CTFE can rely on versus authors of CTFE that I'm not sure. I think in practice, people using Rust would have a hard time understanding that. I have a hard time understanding that distinction.
I think the distinction Ralph's making is that if basically that we're allowed to make UB stop compiling and make further changes. But maybe it's a good question exactly what the way he phrased it now that I think about it is a little strange. Or rather, we'd be allowed to at some point make that UB defined. And so if you were leaning on the fact that it's a compilation error to prevent some further unsoundness that is not directly related to being UB, then your code might no longer work. That's a typical problem with unsafe, that there's like this, right? There's like this gap. Stuff that we say is UB, but we might later make defined, versus stuff that will never be UB, and it's hard to draw that distinction, but kind of important.
I mean, so the two specific examples were use of a poisoned value in control flow and dereferencing a dangling pointer. So like a use after free, for example, I have a hard time imagining that happening for it, but I guess I can imagine like maybe matching on a poison value could wind up being not UB in the future, depending on, you know, something, the discriminant's there, but the innards aren't, or something like that. I don't know. Is that sort of what you had in mind?
To be honest, I hadn't thought about the specific examples. I just know that that's, I think we should have Ralph clarify what he means by that language, because maybe I'm wrong.
Okay. Yeah, in general, like I don't hate the idea. I just like, it seems like an unnecessary thing to promise that we do. Like it feels like the benefits that we get out of promising that we have these checks are very little, when we also don't allow users to rely on the fact that we have these checks, right?
That seems like a reasonable distinction. It's important that we check for them, and it's important that people not get the impression that they're defined behavior. But at the same time, is it important that we guarantee to catch all those things, or just the compiler will make a best effort to catch all those things, and if it misses some, then so be it?
Right. That's sort of how I feel about it.
If we catch enough of them, and in the right, you know, in the most common compiler modes, we catch these issues, then people will realize they can't rely on them, in the same way that if you write code that does integer overflow, it will fail in debug mode. But at the same time, we don't guarantee to catch it.
I have to think about this. I feel like my priors, so to speak, is that I want to catch all the UB. As much as we can.
Oh,
if I'm upset about anything, it's the fact that there's like a list of stuff that might or might not be detected.
To clarify, I also want to catch it. I just don't want to say that we're going to catch it.
I don't understand that. Why would you not want to say that? Like I
Because
want to
I
say
don't
it.
think that's something that users should rely on.
Why?
Because they don't need to, and because it limits our options for the compiler going forward, right? And alternative Rust compilers going forward. It just feels like an unnecessary.
I mean, what does it mean to rely on it? Like what?
I think that's right. I don't think there's much benefit to
right? It's like, where does this help people? Because the only places where I can imagine it being useful to offer this as a guarantee is if people were in some way relying on this behavior, right?
It means that you don't have to audit your code for those kind of bugs.
I disagree. I think you still have to audit your code for those kind of bugs.
I mean, your constant expressions.
Yeah, I guess what you're saying is that you view like const eval, then people can rely on it in the same way that they rely on Myriad to check certain things for them.
Well, they can certainly rely on it for those two specific things that we're offering guarantees about. Whether that's actually useful, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that that's like a use case that I place a lot of value in, is like specifically people throwing code into const eval to see if there are those two specific types of UB.
Well, that's not okay. Let's. I think we should move on, but I think there's a good question that we're getting at here, which is we want to elaborate on what is the benefit of making this guarantee. We also wanted to know sort of what does that language about who can, that's kind of answering in some way the question you were asking earlier, right? Like what can you do and not do as a result of this RFC, and also as a result of saying that users can rely on UB but not authors. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of feels like a promise that like all Rust compilers will forever do this thing, but you can't write any code that expects that thing to occur is kind of what's happening.
Yeah. All right, well, why don't we, can someone post the, like, does everyone agree that these two questions are what we kind of were getting at, and it would be nice to see an answer? I do anyway. I want someone to post them.
Yeah, I think there's a third question in some sense, which is like, what are the benefits to, like, what are the limitations we're imposing on the language team in some sense?
Say more.
In the sense that, like, obviously, if we don't make this guarantee, we can always make it later. But if we do make the guarantee, like, what are we closing out from? Like, can we relax the guarantee later, or is that not okay? That sort of.
Okay.
Yeah, like for example, there's this line about that we will explicitly cause compilation to stop with an error if we use an invalid value in arithmetic logic or logical or control flow. Like that would imply to me that we have some sort of defined notion of what it means to use an invalid value in those sorts of places, so that users, like, you know, I feel like that's like kind of underspecified, but we're saying that we think it's valuable to specify that we will cause an error there.
Yeah, I would be happy to type up a comment, unless Taylor, maybe you feel strongly that you want to do it.
Oh, I feel free to go ahead and respond. I'm probably going to continue talking about it with Ralph just to clarify for myself. But yeah, if you want to leave a comment sort of talking more broadly about the team's thoughts here, that would be great.
Okay, yeah, I will do that then.
Great. Okay, I'm going to skip this until Ryan's here. Oh, he is here. Hi, Ryan. And
Hello.
we'll talk about this. Change visibility scoping rules for macro rules macros. Ryan, take it away.
Yeah, so I'm having a hard time remembering exactly where we were in the discussion last time with this group, but essentially we looked at common patterns that people use in macros, and by common I mean not things that I wouldn't really classify as advanced use cases, but really anything that's non-trivial. And tried to apply the new scoping rules that are being proposed in the RFC. And in particular, recursive macros, so macros that call themselves, are possible, but can be difficult to pull off in the new scheme. In particular, the macro definition needs to use a full path, a full known path to the macro inside of it to call itself. If you're exporting the macro from a crate into another crate, that's generally pretty easy. But for crate local macros, that can sometimes be difficult, or there might not be one canonical path that everywhere else in the crate can refer to that macro from. And so you end up in a situation where it can be a little bit difficult to write a macro that can be used anywhere inside of a crate. There are other slightly more advanced use cases like local macros or private macros, so macros that are defined within other macros. This is a less common use case, but it still can lead to errors in the new system where previously we accepted them because macro shadowing was allowed. And so basically we're kind of at an impasse. Like I don't exactly know where to go from here. I have some ideas and can try to see if I can gain consensus on them. But it would be interesting to see what other people, how other people feel about this point.
So I was just thinking that I was wondering about, I'm trying to decide how much I care about this fact that create local macros may not have a canonical path. Like, in some sense, I'm thinking, well, don't do that. Like,
yeah, single, like at that point you have ownership, right? You can
Right.
write the crate.
Like, why put it in some place that you can't name? I can't imagine ever wanting to do
Well,
that.
it's not only that you can't name, it's that you have to have a canonical way to name it. So a way that you can name it from anywhere in the crate where you would use that. And sure, like that's possible to do, but again, you might run into a situation where one part of your crate wants to refer to it or wants to have certain scoping rules, certain privacy rules, and another part of your crate wants to have different ones, and you have to end up re-architecting your modules basically to make sure that your macro plays nicely.
I'm kind of struggling to imagine this.
I believe that's an issue that applies to things other than macros today, and it's just that macros happened to conveniently bypass it somewhat.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
you already had to solve the problem of how does your macro refer to things in your crate that are not macros, and that is an issue that we should provide a solution for, but it doesn't seem like one that's a critical blocker for making this switch. I think these two issues have different severities. The calling other macros from your crate, or for that matter, recursive macros in your crate, seems like we could make this easier, but it is possible. The shadowing issue is actually a potential blocker for telling people you should use this new mechanism, because we don't have a way to solve that one yet. It's not a blocker for here's a new thing you may optionally use, but if we wanted to say this is the only way that you should use macros, we would need to solve shadowing, but it's not critical that we solve recursion or similar, because people can do that with a challenge, or they could do it by using the old system.
So I realize it's not exactly true that it applies to other kinds of items. Like macros are kind of unique in that they expand in place where they're used. And so, and lacking hygiene, that makes them behave a little differently. Like writing recursive functions, they will not have a problem because they resolve names in the scope where they're defined, not where they're used.
Well, to clarify, the case I was getting at was if you have a macro that calls something else in your crate that isn't a macro, that's an issue today, because you have to go use a path to your crate in order to reference that thing. So it was already an issue to refer to things in your crate from a macro. The change that this would make is that now includes macros.
Yeah, I personally think that you'll run into this issue more with macros, because at least in use cases that I have used macros for, I tend to refer to the macro itself, particularly in like little helper macros that do things like define a whole bunch of structs for me or a whole bunch of types for me. I won't refer to other items outside of my scope, but I might recursively refer to my macro. And in that case, you would run into this issue where you wouldn't have run into it before. So I agree, like this is an issue that exists already, but we might end up introducing it more often, or people might run into it more often in this world. And what I'm worried about in particular is people encountering this more often, getting frustrated by it and knowing that they can just remain on the current system and avoid these problems. And if that's the case, then are we introducing something that no one will want to use? And if that's the case, you know, are we going to end up in a place where we don't want to?
So one thing we didn't, last time we talked about this, one thing we didn't know for sure was how it worked if you had crate, the pub used the macro and gave it another name and a different path and stuff like that. How did $crate work? And I think you did some experiments, Ryan, right, and found out that $crate kind of works hygienically. It always refers to the defining crate, even if that's not something the user could write themselves. Right?
That is correct, yes.
So the main thing is that if we did tie it to the use of the keyword pub, in some sense, the problem is less likely to arise in those scenarios. But
well, again, I think it's less likely to arise in cross-crate usage because you're already going to have to refer to, you're referring to something in crate B that was defined in crate A. And so there will always be a canonical way to refer to that macro through a fully qualified path, like a path from the top level of that crate. But in crate local use cases, that's not necessarily the case. So again, you'll run into this
Can you
more
give me an
often.
example of the pattern within a crate that you think will occur frequently?
Off the top of my head in code here in this document, let me see if I can. I might need a few.
I guess it would
moments.
occur if you did. I think the problem would be if you invoke macros with paths.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about
Okay.
here is macros with paths.
As long as you import the macro, you'll be fine. It's only if you import it if you invoke it with a path that it won't work.
Yeah, and in particular, that also makes it brittle. Like if you require the user to have the macro referable to without a path in front of it, that's a certain use case that you would have to define. Like, hey, this has to be referable by its name and only its name in order to be used. And so you might end up with breakage. Like if people don't read that documentation and they use the macro qualified by a path, it will not work. Whereas if they use it without the path, it will work. And that's a paper cut.
Okay, so the problem we're envisioning is people define a macro foo that invokes itself like foo, right? And then if you use this macro from outside the module, or sorry, if you use some module foo, everything is fine. But if you do some module foo, it breaks.
Exactly.
Right? And the solution is that foo needs to refer to itself as crate some module foo, which implies this path must exist.
Yes. And must exist and must be nameable. I guess that's the same thing, right? Then like create some module needs to be public.
Must be valid anywhere.
Yeah.
That foo may be used. So in particular, if you had this pattern that people sometimes do where you have like private modules that aren't public and you try to just pub use a few things out, it wouldn't work.
Exactly.
On the other hand, today you have to use macro use and a bunch of weird stuff, but it does still work. Okay.
So in your experiments, Ryan, you were able to the case that Nico describes there, it was able to handle in the cross crate case, even if some module wasn't public.
Yes, because crate, like $crate, can kind of peer through private modules. Like it's, and so you always have a way of referring to.
You know what? I just realized I have a double book meeting. I'm gonna transfer this over. Maybe I'll skip this meeting. Never mind.
So just to mention, there was this additional idea of a $ self, which has been met with some with a little bit of pushback that kind of mirrors $crate, but refers to the module in which you are defining the crate, the macro, defining the macro. So if I say $self, I mean the module where I'm defined, and you can refer to the macro in that way. And just like $crate, it doesn't matter if that module is publicly visible, it will just work.
Yeah, but I don't know. I don't feel good about this. For all the reasons we said before. Like, first of all, we decided it was a future compatibility thing, and secondly, and we had another meeting that we thought was very obvious, which was, I think it was, what was it? I forget. It was I guess it was the module that contained the macro.
Yes.
I guess if we used that meaning, it would work, right? You could call yourself as $self : foo. Is that what you proposed, Ryan? Did I miss that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Exactly that.
Sorry.
Yeah. And it was also mentioned that it should probably capital S self to as a potential different syntax.
Right.
Because,
$lowercase self just breaks too many things in the ecosystem to be reasonable to introduce, but that's a syntactic issue.
Yeah.
If we have a mechanism like this, it will likely help, but so will $crate full path macro, assuming that your macro is exported at a established place from your crate.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem critical to have an equivalent to $self here when $crate full path macro is an option. We could even potentially lint for this. If you write pub foo, and foo obviously is calling foo itself, then we could provide a lint that says, hey, if you want this recursion to actually work, you may wish to use a full path involving $crate.
Sorry, I think I actually have to drop for this other meeting. I'm looking at it. It's a required training thing. Josh, I'm going to make you host. Okay. Do you mind picking up the meeting?
Yeah, I can pick up from here.
Okay. Sorry, y'all. Okay, there, you're host now, I think.
Okay. Seems to work.
Cool.
So for this one, rather than do an extensive discussion of trying to solve the problem in this meeting, it seems like we may want to take the full solution space exploration to Zulip or similar. But I think the higher level question is, which of these problems need solving in order for us to go forward with this, either as an option or as a new default?
Yeah, and in particular with the new default question, with Rust 2021 coming fast approaching and the timelines that have been set out for that, we sort of have to either solve these issues immediately or in the next couple of weeks, or one of the possibilities of this being a new default kind of falls away, at least for the next few years.
Yeah, I guess I have a maybe higher level question in some sense. I personally am getting the sense that this is a pretty big can of worms, and that we can potentially spend a lot of time, working out potential alternatives or the solution space, and potentially what we should say instead is that macros as they stand today, work okay, and maybe there's pain points, but maybe this is not the the thing to tackle at this juncture.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that, just because given the complexity that we're seeing here, I do wonder if it's if this is the right time to solve this, because I do worry most about ending up in a situation where we have a hybrid approach and it's hard to teach because in some situations you use one approach and in others you use another. And it's really hard to gauge whether the new public or the new scoping rules would allow enough expressivity in order to meet most use cases, to where 99%, let's say, of Rust users don't ever have to use the old system of scoping. If we could have a guarantee there that most people will never see macro export or macro use again, I would feel a lot better about this proposal. But the fact that we can't reach that conclusion today makes me hesitant.
I would propose one distinction there. I think that this is a sufficiently large can of worms that we should not try to make macro rules mean pub self macro rules and just completely transition in this next edition. There are too many things that need solving, and if we found two this quickly, there may be more that we're not aware of. But that isn't necessarily a blocker for us introducing this mechanism, first of all, as an option for pub macro rules, pub self macro rules, and just not change the behavior of macro rules. And it's also not a blocker for us introducing this as an unstable nightly feature for people to experiment with and try to find more of these problems. And then we can evaluate further if and when we decide to stabilize this, whether there are any issues that would block us from doing that. I think that, does anybody feel like these issues are blockers for even experimenting with this feature, or are they just blockers for trying to transition to this as the default?
Well, wait, so I thought Ryan had said that they had a concern about if you try to introduce these new things without addressing the problems, then you're going to have this hybrid system where macro rules behaves differently than the case where you had pub in front of it. It's going to be hard for users to understand when they're supposed to use one versus the other, right? Did that come through?
No, that did come through. That's what I'm trying to ask to put the discussion on, rather than the specifics of the issue related to trying to solve the problem in time for an edition. I'm asking the question of, is that an issue? Do we consider that a blocker in terms of having two different systems? Would that be too much complexity for people to deal with to experiment? That seems like the right thing for us to be discussing.
Yeah, I guess I feel it is. I don't think we should, like, I would not want to spend link team bandwidth and compiler team bandwidth and sort of, even if we had everything implemented, I think that I would not want to be in a position where we have, even potentially temporarily, an opt-in to this alternative system.
I see.
I
So
think
you
I
feel
think
like
it's not.
until we
Yeah.
solve these other problems, we should not even introduce the system as an opt-in, and
Right.
we should instead let it bake slowly and be introduced with, and here's how you do this, and here's how you do this, and here's how you do this.
Yeah, I think I would feel more comfortable if we had sort of obvious answers, but maybe they, were difficult to implement or something. But I think at this point, what it feels like to me is that sort of the answers start easily treading on the sort of holy grail of, hygienic macros.
That's fair.
And since we haven't solved that, in multiple years now, it feels unlikely that, half a month or a month of effort from Ryan or some other folks is going to significantly move the needle there. And it feels to me that without that, any partial solution is going to be ultimately another stepping stone, and we might end up with, three alternative systems: the legacy one, the kind of trying to be hygienic but not hygienic, and eventually maybe a hygienic macro solution.
That
And
makes sense.
I really don't want that.
No, I certainly don't think any of us would want that, of here's this halfway point that didn't quite make it, and then here's the full system. Does that concern apply to experimentation in nightly in terms of trying to get this right in progress through experimentation, or just does that apply to stable? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think the design questions here are significant enough that even adding it to nightly requires some amount of like thinking and you know, sort of effort, and potentially, you know, there's a question of, you know, I don't know, similar to how we had with like macros 1.2 or whatever, if prominent crates in the ecosystem that are nightly only for other reasons start using it, then we don't get locked in necessarily, but there's sort of a open question of like, okay, maybe we, you know, want to stabilize a subset, and I don't know, I guess I don't want to open that can of worms at all.
Fair. That's fair. Any
But
thoughts from anyone
obviously
else on that point?
others may disagree.
No,
Yeah, I'm not
no,
as.
it's a
I
fair
guess-
point.
Yeah, I'm
Well,
more
go ahead.
inclined to be okay with nightly only, but I mean, but it's tricky.
I do think though, like that if we do reach a point where we can get this to work, where we can have a full transition, let's say in Rust 2024, if that were to happen, like this would be a better system. And I don't necessarily think that the problems are as difficult as a fully hygienic system have proven to be. So I'm kind of hopeful that we can reach a point there, and I would be a little sad to see this kind of wither away into nothing. And having something in nightly means that we can continue to think through these problems for the next, you know, couple of years. But I'm sympathetic to what Mark said. Like then you end up in a weird situation where somebody starts using it seriously.
I should say, I don't think that we should make this conditional on let's not do anything till we can do a full macros 2.0. I don't think we should let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I am sympathetic to the point of let's not do a partial solution that we know has known issues before we even introduce it, and therefore prevents people from transitioning. That I could sympathize a great deal with. If we solve those issues, we could potentially introduce this, even if it's not full macros 2.0.
Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah, and I think the important bit for me is also that it feels to me like some of the design points on the spectrum we've discussed so far are not necessarily in conflict, but at least would be sort of like, if we did have hygiene, they would be not entirely obviously compatible, in the sense that, like, you know, you would want to write it a different way, and that way might require you to make some backwards incompatible change, which feels unfortunate. Yeah, but I agree that I think that I don't sort of want to see this wither away, but I do think that maybe the right path is sort of not even necessarily a project group, but more so saying that, like, hey, you know, maybe we can have a like a lane team design note or whatever, and if people are interested in sort of investing in designing a better system, then we're broadly interested in, you know, that work can happen outside the lane team perhaps, and sort of we're happy to give feedback on specific proposals. But
So it sounds like we have a semi-emerging consensus here of encourage some ongoing design work to solve those issues, and then we can reevaluate when there is a proposed solution that incorporates addressing recursive macros, addressing local helper macros, and anything else that comes up along the way. What do people think of that proposal?
Seems fine.
Okay.
I'm happy with that, and I guess the most immediate outcome of that decision is that this should not be a part of Rust 2021.
Yeah, I think that's the important takeaway from this discussion.
That's definitely true. I think it was borderline whether we were going to do that transition on Rust 2021 to begin with, and we'd more or less said we might consider it if there are no issues. It's pretty clear there are issues. So we're certainly not going to do it for Rust 2021, which means it's decoupled from a timeline. We'll look at it again when it's ready.
Sounds good.
yeah, I think potentially the immediate action item, I am happy to type up a comment sort of summarizing what we discussed today, or if someone else wants to, that's great too. And I think there is an open RFC, so potentially we can FCP close that, particularly as Taylor and Nico are not here.
do we want FCP close or FCP postpone here? Because we are
Uh,
effectively saying come back when you have a
I don't. I guess
proposal
I
that
don't
covers-
care. I don't. I don't see it as a significant difference, but I'm happy with either.
I think it's a positional disposition of like, are we discouraging this or are we saying this seems fine but come back later?
Well, I mean, the current proposal does not seem fine. So, in that
Well, yes,
sense,
obviously.
um,
Okay.
but in any case, I guess if no one's opposed, I can leave that comment, and then ping someone on the lane team to actually initiate the FCP.
Okay, I've written an action item there. Can somebody add that to the action items document as well?
Yeah, I'm taking care of that.
Okay. Then let's move on to declarative macro metavariable expressions. This is RFC 3086. So this grew out of what was originally the declarative macro repetition count proposal, and instead grew into a exploration of the syntax space to introduce general expressions in macros that don't conflict with Rust syntax, to do things like counting the number of cases of an identifier, or obtaining a length of a given repetition or index of a repetition, that kind of thing, to avoid having to invent these as recursive macro counter helpers, that kind of thing. So there are kind of two pieces to this. There is the syntactic space of reserving $open brace ... close brace to provide macro expressions that we can define, which is a potentially useful piece of syntax space that avoids some of the issues we've talked about in the past of where do we put this syntax. And then there's the specific proposals for what we do with that, such as count, index, length, etc. Has anyone had a chance to read this proposal? And there was a set of action items for 3 people to review. It looks like of those 3 people, we just have Felix here.
Yeah, I have not looked at this yet. I'm scanning it now.
Okay.
I have looked at this. To me, it looks very useful, and yeah, I'm all for it.
Good feedback.
Like, my first reaction was like, oh, that looks a bit complicated. But then you look at how you would do those things right now, and in all cases, it would make it much, much less complicated. A good example of that is the first comment on the RFC itself. There's a comment with someone saying like, oh, you can already do this like this. And then you're like, oh my God, that's a perfect example of how you absolutely do not want to do that.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's a good motivation for this RFC.
Okay. So we had action items for people to review. We don't want to necessarily block on that in this meeting, and the proposal on the table was to FCP merge and then let people read before checking boxes. Any objections to that at this point, or shall we go ahead with that? Okay. I can take the action item for this one to write up a summary and propose merge with a note of expecting that it may take some time to for people to review and check off.
Yeah, sounds perfect.
Okay, that is all of the new RFCs. Let's take a look at some of the P-high issues. So I'm going to skip over RepRC as unsound on MSVC targets for the moment, because I suspect that 12 minutes may not be enough to go through that in detail. And I think that is the only P-high issue at the moment. So I would suggest that we actually can go on to nominated PRs and issues, unless people specifically want to try to cover that one in this meeting. Okay. 65516 was a nominated issue proposing to deprecate weird nesting of items, things like mods inside functions or similar. And this was proposed some time ago, and the proposal in the notes here is Nico suggested we don't do anything to deprecate this. We could potentially soft deprecate it in the future without that being tied to an edition, but that we not try to do this for this edition. Any thoughts on that? Felix?
I like doing nothing. I'm fine with doing nothing. I always like doing nothing, almost always.
Sounds fair. Yeah, trying to deprecate this certainly does seem like it would introduce a substantial amount of churn. There is some potential value attached to removing syntax in the future that IDEs don't enjoy, but they will always need to deal with old Rust code potentially. So I think that we should FCP close this by way of not tying it to the edition, and if someone wants to make a proposal for soft deprecating in the future not tied to an edition, we can do that. Would somebody like to take the action item to write up a summary of the proposal here and to propose FCP close?
Yeah, I can take that action item.
Okay. All right, next we have stabilize the unsafe op and unsafe function lint, and that one is in FCP and is due to be merged, so I don't think this needs to be nominated anymore. So I will unmark it nominated. Next up, allow super in module in block to refer to block items. I can give a quick summary of this one. It is a proposal to handle, oddly enough, weird nesting of items, specifically a module inside of a block or a module inside of a fun to handle other things locally defined in that fun. It was introduced with the notion in mind of if you have code that works at top level, it should also work if you drop it inside of a function, because that's what unit tests or doc tests rather do. The counterpoint to that is this would introduce a weird special case in our name resolution, which name resolution is not something we want a lot of weird special cases in. And as an easy means of evaluating this, I am doing a crater run right now on the theory of if this introduces even the slightest amount of breakage, it's not worth the transition pain, and we should try to solve that issue an entirely different way, or at all. And only if the crater run passes would we then consider, do we want to consider this, or do we want to just reject it? But do people have high-level thoughts on this proposal and whether we may want to solve it at all?
I guess I'm sympathetic to the problem, but I don't think this is the right solution. And I feel like generally I'm not a fan of complicating our complex name resolution system by adding more things that you can potentially refer to.
Fair. Others? Ryan, Felix, Mara?
Yeah, I don't know. If creator reports no bugs at all, it'd be interesting to think about it, I guess. I don't know.
That was kind of my reaction. If Crater reports no issues, then we could consider, but even then, I'm sympathetic to what Mark just said, that complicating name resolution may not be the right way to solve this, and maybe we should consider if there's another way to solve it.
Yeah, I guess to elaborate, it also feels like a very patchwork solution in the sense that in I don't know. I rarely use super : like I just don't. I like referring to things more generally, I think. But it feels like if we want to refer to things in a block and sort of want to enable that, I would want some sort of more complete, probably an RFC that says, okay, so this is the problem, here's the solution space, working through
Right.
more holistically than just, oh, we can add, this one special case and it seems to work okay.
I would agree with that. Ironically, the one case where I tend to use super is in writing unit tests in order to refer to the parent module from a mod tests, and that seems like a thing unlikely to happen itself inside a doc test, unless you're documenting the unit test mechanism.
Yeah,
So,
I agree that I use it there, but I think I don't have modules inside blocks usually, so it's not.
okay. It sounds like this probably isn't a thing we should do even if the crater run passes, but regardless, we may want to consider a potential solution, but it's probably shaped differently. All right. Allow qualified paths in struct construction. 80080.
Before we move on, Josh, do you want to
sure, go
take
on.
an action item to type up a comment, or maybe someone else?
Sure, yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
I will also suggest steering discussion of alternatives over to either internals or Zulip and see if people want to start figuring out other ways they could solve that problem that may be less invasive. Okay. Next up, we have allow qualified paths in struct construction, 80080. We did discuss this last week. The main thing we didn't get to was a concrete proposal for what exactly we wanted our next step to be, but Ryan was going to Ryan suggested the action item was to try to get all different uses implemented, and that's still in progress. So Ryan, are you aware of anything that needs further evaluation here for nomination?
No,
in this
I
meeting,
think
I mean?
no, in this meeting, no. I guess it would be once it's implemented, we should see if there's any issues, and if there aren't any issues, then we would propose for just sign off.
Sounds reasonable. In that case, do you want to drop the nominated flag for now?
I will do that.
I'm not going to add an action item for that because removing a label is easily done in the meeting. We have a lint-related item for bear trait objects. This was deferred on the basis of let's discuss lints and put out a complete proposal. Ryan, do you want to say more on that?
We're meeting after this meeting to continue discussing lents, and I think what we should do is just from that return back to how we address lents in general.
Sounds great. Where is that meeting taking place if people might wish to participate?
I believe we were talking about it in Zulip on the edition 2021 topic, and then inside of Lent promotion, so I can post a link to that.
Okay. All right, then we have, in the 1 minute we have left, let's see if we can get one more. Invalid field is never read, lint warning, 81658. The question was, what do we consider a read? If you, a destructor, for example, if you're only having a field for the purposes of letting it be dropped or being read by FFI. It sounds like the complaint here is that Rust shouldn't lint in this case. I'm wondering how it could not lint in this case and whether the underscore proposal is not what the ideal solution would be. Or is there a false positive here that is not just this is read by FFI or drop? Is anyone familiar with this one?
I don't think we have time right now to
Yeah.
discuss it in full.
No, I don't think we do. Okay. So that is the end of our time. We will get to the later items in a later meeting.
All right.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
all.
And see some of you for the Lent meeting.